The moon was a sliver of bone in a sky of black velvet, offering no comfort to the land below. At the Miller Ranch, the only light came from the lonely yellow square of a single window, a solitary beacon in the vast, breathing darkness of the plains. Inside, Alara Miller traced the rim of a cold cup of tea, the silence of the house, a weight as heavy as the grief she had carried for a year. It was a silence her late husband, Sheriff Thomas Miller, had once filled with his steady presence. Now it was just an echo. The first sound was wrong. Not the familiar cry of a coyote or the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods, but the splintering crack of dry timber. Then another closer this time. A thud against the corral fence. Alara's heart seized. She froze, listening, her hand hovering over the lantern on the table. The quiet returned, but it was different now. A predator's silence, coiled and waiting. Suddenly, the night erupted. A chorus of whoops and hollers ripped through the air, followed by the thunder of a dozen galloping horses. Orange light flickered against the window pane, growing brighter with an unnatural speed. Alara scrambled to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. She threw open the front door, and the heat hit her like a fist. The barn, her husband's pride, and the heart of their ranch, was a roaring inferno. Flames licked at the sky, casting demonic dancing shadows across the yard. Masked horsemen circled the blaze, their dark forms silhouetted against the fire, their shouts lost in the crackle and roar of burning wood. They were scattering her cattle, driving the terrified animals out onto the open plains where they would be lost to her forever. This was not robbery. This was a message. A brutal, fiery warning. Panic clawed at her throat. She stumbled forward onto the porch, a strangled cry escaping her lips. Her world was burning. Everything Thomas had built, everything she had clung to in the year since his death, was turning to ash before her eyes. In her haste, her hand flew to her neck, fumbling with the clasp of the silver locket she always wore. It slipped from her trembling fingers, falling with a soft thud into the thick dust of the yard, unnoticed in the chaos. From the shadows of the porch, a figure emerged, moving not with the frantic energy of the raiders, but with a deliberate, massive calm. Silas. The man she had hired just a week ago, a giant of a man, whose silence was as vast and imposing as the landscape itself. He had been sleeping in the small bunkhouse beside the stable. But he was here now, his broad shoulders blocking the hellish light of the fire. He took in the scene with a chilling stillness, his eyes dark and unreadable, missing nothing. He saw the raiders, the burning barn, the panicked cattle, and he saw her standing, frozen in despair. His gaze dropped to the ground, and in the flickering firelight, he saw the glint of silver. Without a word, he moved past her. His large frame seemed to soak up the noise and the fear around him. He walked directly into the chaotic yard, the raiders giving his immense form a wide berth as he bent down. With surprising gentleness, his large calloused hands that could split a log with a single axe blow, brushed the dust from the locket. He held it for a moment, his thumb passing over the intricate engraving on its surface, before turning back to her. He walked up the porch steps, the firelight catching the grim set of his jaw, and pressed the locket into her palm. His fingers were warm against her icy skin. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. In that single silent act, he had retrieved more than a piece of silver. He had saved a memory, a tether to the life that was being ripped away from her. The gesture forged a bond between them, a quiet promise made in the heart of the flames. Alara clutched the locket, the metal cool against her skin now, and looked up into the stoic face of the man she barely knew, realizing that the greatest danger might not be the fire, but the silent giant who had just stepped out of the shadows to stand by her side. The memory of that night was still a fresh wound a week later, but it was overshadowed by the memory of the day that brought Silas to her ranch. The town of redemption, a dusty collection of clapboard buildings baking under the unforgiving sun, was a place that lived up to its name, only for those who had something left to be redeemed. For most, it was a purgatory of grit and quiet desperation. Alara Miller, dressed in the severe black of a widow, had walked through its main street, feeling the burn of 100 pairs of eyes. She was there for the auction, not for livestock or foreclosed property, but for men. The practice was a grim necessity on the frontier, a way for the territory to handle its overflow of prisoners and debtors. Men, some hardened criminals, others just victims of bad luck, were sold into indentured servitude, their labor bought for a term of 1 to 5 years. It was a cruel and ugly business. But Alara's ranch was failing. After the long winter and the loss of her husband, she was a woman alone, and the whispers around town were that she wouldn't last until the first snow. She needed hands, strong hands, and she had sold the last of her mother's jewelry to afford this one desperate gamble. The auction was held in the dusty square in front of the marshal's office. A crude wooden platform stood empty, awaiting its human cargo. The air was thick with the scent of sagebrush, hot dust, and cheap whiskey from the saloon next door. The crowd was a mix of ranchers looking for cheap labor and townsfolk drawn by the grim spectacle. They parted for Alara as she approached their murmurs like the rustling of dry leaves. Sheriff Miller's widow, one man muttered. Too proud to ask for help, but not too proud for this. Alara ignored them, her chin held high, though her stomach was a knot of shame and fear. The auctioneer, a portly man with a sweat-stained collar, began the proceedings. One by one, men were brought out, their wrists bound. They were gaunt, defeated figures, their eyes fixed on the dirt. The bidding was brisk and brutal. Then they brought him out. He was the last one. The crowd fell silent, a collective gasp rippling through the onlookers. He was a giant towering over the guards, who pushed him forward. His shoulders were as wide as a barn door, his hair a mane of dark, unruly waves, and his face was a mask of stone. But it was his eyes that held them all captive. They were not defeated. They were ancient and watchful, burning with a quiet intensity that seemed to defy the chains on his wrists. The auctioneer cleared his throat, unnerved by the man's presence. This one. Silas, convicted of assault, sentenced to 3 years' labor. Strong back if you can handle him. The implication was clear: he was dangerous. The bidding started low, hesitant. Ranchers who had eagerly bought other men now eyed Silas with suspicion. He was too much. Too big, too unbroken. Alara watched him, her breath caught in her throat. She saw the raw power in him, but she also saw something else. A profound stillness, a containment of that power that was more intimidating than any overt threat. While the other men had shuffled, he stood rooted to the platform, as solid and unmovable as the mesas on the horizon. He needed to be strong. He needed to be a deterrent. He needed to be someone who would make men think twice before crossing her property line. He was a storm wrapped in flesh, and her sinking ranch needed a storm. $20, a coarse voice called out. 25, another followed. The bidding crept upward, but it lacked the fever of the earlier sales. Alara waited, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had $100, every last cent she had. She had to make it count. The bidding stalled at 40. $40 going once, the auctioneer began. Alara's gaze met Silas's across the dusty square. For a fleeting second, his impassive mask seemed to crack. His eyes locked onto hers, and in their depths she saw not malice, but a flicker of something she couldn't name, a weary recognition, perhaps. It was enough. $100, she said. Her voice was clear and steady, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. A shocked silence fell over the square. Heads swiveled in her direction. $100 was a fortune for an indentured man, especially one with a dangerous reputation. It was an act of pure desperation, and everyone knew it. The auctioneer's eyes widened. He looked from the pale, determined widow to the silent giant on the platform. $100 from Mrs. Miller. Going once, going twice. Sold. The gavel slammed down the sound like a gunshot in the silent square. The transaction was a blur. Signing the papers, her hand shaking as she inked her name onto the contract that made her the master of this formidable man. The marshal grunted his approval, handing her the key to Silas's manacles. When the guards brought him to her, he towered over her, casting a long shadow that swallowed her whole. But as he stood before her, he did something unexpected. He lowered his head not in shame or subservience, but in a gesture of quiet reverence, as though he were kneeling before a truth only he could see. The ride back to the ranch had been a trial of tense silence. She sat on the wagon seat, clutching the reins, acutely aware of the massive chained figure walking steadily behind. He never faltered his long strides, easily keeping pace with the horse through the deepening twilight. She had bought his labor, but a cold dread told her she had invited something into her life that she could not possibly control. Now standing amidst the smoldering ruins of her barn, a week later, clutching the locket he had returned to her, she understood that her gamble had just begun. He was more than a hired hand. He was a silent guardian, and his presence had already drawn a new, more dangerous line in the sand. 2 days after the fire, a polished black buggy drawn by a pair of perfectly matched jet-black horses rolled up the long, dusty track to Alara's ranch. It was an ostentatious display of wealth that was utterly out of place amidst the smoke-stained landscape and the quiet struggle for survival. Alara watched its approach from her porch, her hand resting on the worn stock of her husband's rifle. Silas was nearby, methodically clearing charred timber from the barn's foundation, his movements slow and powerful. He paused his back to the approaching buggy, but she knew he was listening, as aware as any wolf sensing a rival in its territory. The man who stepped out of the buggy was as immaculate as his transportation. Atticus Blackwood was tall and slender, dressed in a tailored black suit that seemed to repel the dust of the plains. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and his face was a handsome, chiseled mask of civility. He owned the largest cattle empire in the territory, a vast expanse of land that bordered Alara's on 3 sides. He was a man whose power was felt everywhere, though he was rarely seen. He removed his hat, revealing a clean, unweathered brow. "Mrs. Miller," he began, his voice smooth and educated, a chilling contrast to the raw brutality of the raid. "A terrible tragedy. I came as soon as I heard about your fire. To offer my condolences and my assistance, of course." Ilara's grip tightened on the rifle. "I'm managing Mr. Blackwood." Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. They were the color of a winter sky, cold and empty. He surveyed the wreckage, his gaze lingering on the smoldering beams before shifting to Silas, who had not stopped his work. Blackwood's eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second, a flicker of appraisal before he turned back to Alara. "Resilience is an admirable quality, Mrs. Miller. Your husband, the late Sheriff Miller, was a very resilient man. Stubborn, some might say." He let the word hang in the air. "Which brings me to a delicate matter. It seems the sheriff, in his preoccupation with civic duty, let some of his personal affairs fall into disarray." He reached into his breast pocket and produced a folded sheaf of papers, extending them to her. "I'm afraid he left behind a significant debt. To me." Alara stared at the documents, refusing to take them. "My husband was a meticulous man. He owed no one." "Ah, but he did," Blackwood said, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "For supplies feed loans to cover taxes over the years. It has accumulated, you see. The total is quite substantial." He unfolded the top page. The number at the bottom was staggering in amount he knew she could never pay. I have no wish to bring hardship upon a grieving widow. I am prepared to be more than generous. I will forgive the entire debt in exchange for the deed to this land. The pieces clicked into place. The raid wasn't just a warning. It was the first stage of a siege designed to break her spirit before he delivered the killing blow. "This is a lie," Alara said, her voice shaking with rage. "This ranch is all I have left of him. I will not be scared off by thugs in the night or forged papers, Mr. Blackwood." Blackwood's smile finally vanished. The mask of civility dropped, revealing the predator beneath. "Thugs, my dear Mrs. Miller, you wound me. I employ businessmen, not criminals. As for the papers, they are all legally binding. The circuit judge will verify it. This land is contiguous with my prime grazing territory. It rightfully belongs to me. Your husband was simply too sentimental to see it. I am giving you a chance to walk away with your dignity." From the ruins of the barn, a heavy timber shifted with a groan. Silas had stopped working. He turned slowly, his face unreadable, and fixed his gaze on Blackwood. He didn't move closer, he didn't speak, but his presence suddenly filled the yard, a silent physical challenge. Blackwood's eyes flicked to Silas, a hint of annoyance in his expression. He seemed to dismiss him as little more than a piece of equipment. "You have a week to consider my offer," he said to Alara, his voice regaining its smooth veneer. "After that, I will be forced to pursue the matter through legal channels. It would be unpleasant for everyone." He placed the fraudulent debt notice on the porch railing, turned, and climbed back into his buggy. As the carriage pulled away, raising a cloud of dust that choked the air, Silas walked over. He picked up the papers from the railing, his large thumb brushing over the forged signature of Thomas Miller. He looked from the paper to Alara's pale, defiant face. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, rumbling bass, as deep and steady as the earth. "They'll be back," he said simply. "We need to be ready." It wasn't a question or a suggestion. It was a statement of fact, a declaration that her fight was now his. That night, Alara couldn't sleep. She sat at her husband's old desk, the lamp casting a warm pool of light over his ledgers. Thomas had been methodical to a fault. Every transaction, every debt paid, every dollar earned was recorded in his neat, precise hand. She searched for hours, her hope dwindling with every turned page. There was no record of any loan from Atticus Blackwood, not a single mention of his name. She was staring at a photograph on the mantelpiece, Thomas in his sheriff's uniform, his face proud and honest, when Silas entered the main room. He moved with a quietness that was unnerving for a man his size. He carried a small leather-bound journal. "I found this in the bunkhouse," he said, his voice low. It was the previous hand's. He left in a hurry. Sometimes men write things down. Alara took the journal. The entries were mostly mundane complaints about the weather and the work. But near the end, one entry stood out, dated a month before Thomas's death. "Sheriff came by today. Looked worried. Asked me if I'd seen any of Blackwood's men near the North Ridge. Said Blackwood was a snake in the grass, that he'd been sniffing around this land for years. Said it wasn't about the water or the grazing. Said it was older than that. Deeper." "Older than that," Alara whispered, reading the words aloud. "What could be older than a land dispute?" Silas stood by the fireplace, his gaze fixed on the portrait of Sheriff Miller. In the flickering firelight, Alara saw him flinch, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw, as if the name itself was a painful memory. It was the first crack she had seen in his stoic armor. The raid, the fire, Blackwood's threats, he had met them all with an unnerving calm. But the sight of her husband's face seemed to stir something deep within him. "We need to go to town," she said, her resolve hardening. If there's a reason for this beyond the land, the answers won't be here. They'll be in redemption. Silas nodded slowly, his eyes still on the portrait. The town remembers, he said, his voice quiet and heavy. But it doesn't always like to talk. He looked at her then, and for the first time, she saw a shadow of a troubled past in his eyes, a history that was somehow intertwined with the very danger that now threatened her home. The next day they rode into redemption. The town felt different now. The stares that had once been filled with pity and scorn were now laced with fear. Blackwood's presence lingered like a sickness. People averted their eyes as Alara and Silas passed, conversations dying in their wake. Blackwood didn't just own the land. He owned the people's silence. Their first stop was the blacksmith, a burly man named Jebediah, who had been a friend of her husband's. He was shoeing a horse, the ring of his hammer, a lonely rhythmic sound in the quiet street. When he saw them, he stopped, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a grimy hand. "Alara," he said, his voice cautious, "I heard about the fire. A terrible thing." "Jebediah, I need to ask you something," Alara said, getting straight to the point. "About my husband and Atticus Blackwood? Thomas told you everything. Was there bad blood between them, something more than just a dispute over a property line?" Jebediah's eyes darted around the street nervously. He lowered his voice. "Thomas was a good man, Alara. A fair man. But he made enemies. Blackwood, he's not a man you cross. Thomas knew things about him. Things from a long time ago." "What things?" Silas asked, his voice a low rumble that made the blacksmith startle. Jebediah shook his head, refusing to meet their gaze. "It ain't my place to say. But if you're looking for answers, you might talk to Doc Abernathy. He patches up the whole territory, the righteous and the damned. He keeps secrets better than a priest." Doc Abernathy was a grizzled, weary man whose office smelled of carbolic acid and regret. He was stitching up a gash on a ranch hand's arm when they entered. He nodded to Alara, his eyes lingering on Silas, with professional curiosity, as if sizing up a man who must have a dozen old injuries to tell stories about. "Sheriff Miller was the best lawman this territory ever saw," Abernathy said, his fingers working deftly with the needle. "He wasn't afraid of anyone, not even Blackwood." Jebediah said Thomas knew something about Blackwood's past, Alara pressed. The doctor finished his stitch and tied it off. He sighed, a long, tired sound. "Everyone knows the story, Mrs. Miller. They just don't talk about it. About 5 years back, before you and the sheriff were married, Blackwood's younger brother Liam got himself into some trouble. He was young, reckless, ran with a bad crowd. They tried to rob the bank right here in Redemption." The air in the small office grew heavy. Silas, who had been standing by the door like a silent sentinel, went utterly still. "It went bad," the doctor continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Shots were fired. Thomas, he was just a deputy, then responded. In the chaos, Liam Blackwood was killed. Atticus never forgave him. He blamed Thomas for his brother's death, said the deputy was trigger-happy. Alara felt a cold dread seep into her bones. This wasn't about land. It was never about the land. It was a vendetta, a deep, obsessive quest for revenge against a dead man. And she was the last piece of that man left to destroy. But the official report said Liam was caught in the crossfire. She said, her mind racing. Official reports can be neat, Doc Abernathy said grimly. Atticus has a long reach. He can make paper say whatever he wants it to say. But I was the one who pulled the bullet out of that boy. And I can tell you this. He paused, looking directly at Alara. The bullet that killed Liam Blackwood didn't come from a lawman's pistol. The implication was horrifying, a truth so dark, it seemed to suck the air from the room. Before Ilara could process it, the doctor turned his attention to a dusty cabinet in the corner. Thomas knew something was wrong. He spent weeks investigating quietly. He kept his notes locked away, said he needed undeniable proof. He stored his old case files in the back room of the marshal's office. If anyone can find them, it's you. They left the doctor's office and headed for the marshal's building. The current marshal, a man named Calloway, was a timid, overwhelmed man who owed his position to Blackwood's influence. He was reluctant to let Ilara into the records room, but the widow of the celebrated Sheriff Miller was a hard woman to deny. The room was small and musty, filled with file cabinets and stacked boxes of paper. The scent of decaying ink and time hung heavy in the air. For hours they searched, sifting through records of cattle rustling, bar fights, and land disputes. Silas moved with a surprising grace, his large hands carefully turning brittle pages. He worked in silence, but there was a new tension in him, a coiled energy that hadn't been there before. He was not just a helper now. He was a hunter. Finally, tucked away in a mislabeled box at the bottom of a stack, Ilara found a thin file labeled Redemption Bank Robbery. Inside were Thomas's handwritten notes, a map of the bank, and a sealed envelope. Her hands trembled as she broke the wax seal. Inside was a single folded letter. It was a sworn affidavit from a teller who had been in the bank that day, a young woman who had fled the territory shortly after. It happened so fast. The letter read, "The younger one, Liam, he got scared. He wanted to back out. He was shouting at his brother Atticus, telling him it was wrong. But the older one wouldn't listen. When the deputy started shooting from the street, Atticus, he turned his gun. I saw it. He shot his own brother in the back. He looked at me, and his eyes, they were like a snake's. He said Liam was a liability. Then he ran." Ilara dropped the letter as if it had burned her. The room swayed around her. Blackwood hadn't just let his brother die. He had murdered him in cold blood. Thomas hadn't been responsible for Liam's death. He had been the only one willing to uncover the truth, a truth that would have destroyed Atticus Blackwood. She looked up at Silas, her eyes wide with horror and understanding. He was staring at the letter in her hand, his face a granite mask of pain. The silence stretched between them, thick with the ghosts of the past. "You were there," she whispered, the realization dawning on her with sickening certainty. "You were part of his gang." Silas did not deny it. He closed his eyes for a long moment, and when he opened them, the torment within them was laid bare. "I was," he said, his voice raw. "I was the one Sheriff Miller arrested. I was the one who took the fall for it all." The pieces of the puzzle slammed together. Blackwood's obsessive vendetta, Silas's presence at the indentured auction, his silent vow to protect her. It was all tied to that one violent day 5 years ago. Blackwood wasn't just trying to destroy the last remnant of Sheriff Miller's life. He was trying to bury the last living witness to his own monstrous crime. As the weight of this revelation settled over them, the dust-choked air of the records room began to feel like a tomb. The stakes had been raised to a terrifying new level. This was no longer a fight for land or even for revenge. It was a battle for the truth, a truth that Blackwood would kill to keep buried, and a truth that had now put them both squarely in his sights. The days that followed were a quiet war. Blackwood escalated his campaign of terror, shifting from veiled threats to open aggression. One morning, Ilara found their well had been poisoned, the water tainted with lye, forcing Silas to haul barrels from the creek miles away. Another night, a small fire was set in the tall grass at the edge of her property, a clear attempt to burn her out. Silas, seeming to anticipate every move, was always there. He worked tirelessly, his vigilance a silent shield around the ranch. He patrolled the perimeter at night, a hulking shadow against the starlight. And during the day, he repaired fences and reinforced the doors, his hammer blows echoing with grim purpose. Through it all, a new and profound intimacy grew between them, forged in shared danger and unspoken truths. The terrible knowledge they now shared was a chasm, but it was also a bridge. One evening, as Ilara cleaned her husband's rifle on the porch, watching Silas split firewood with a relentless, focused energy, she finally broke the silence that had surrounded his confession. "Why didn't you tell him?" she asked, her voice soft. "Sheriff Miller. Why didn't you tell him what Blackwood did?" Silas paused, his axe buried deep in a log. He rested his hands on the handle, his massive chest rising and falling with his breath. "I tried," he said, his back still to her. "When he arrested me, I told him the whole story. But it was my word against Atticus Blackwood's. Who would a jury believe, a known drifter or the wealthiest man in the territory?" He finally turned to face her, his eyes filled with a weary resignation. "But your husband." He listened. He didn't dismiss it. I could see in his eyes that he believed me. He said he'd look into it, that the truth has a way of finding the light. He was the first lawman who ever treated me like a man, not just a criminal. He walked over to the porch and sat on the steps, the wood groaning under his weight. He put me away for 5 years for my part in the robbery. I deserved it. But I think he knew he was also keeping me safe, keeping me out of Blackwood's reach. While I was in prison, I heard he'd married. I heard he was happy." He looked at her, his gaze direct and heavy with meaning. "When I was released, I heard he was dead. And I heard his widow was alone, struggling. I owed him a debt for that one moment of justice he showed me. So I made sure I was on that auction block in redemption." Tears welled in Ilara's eyes. This silent, formidable man hadn't been bought. He had chosen. His servitude was a self-imposed penance, an act of loyalty to the memory of the man who had imprisoned him. She reached out her hand, resting on his powerful forearm. The muscle beneath was tense, hard as iron. "He suspected the truth," she whispered, thinking of the letter. "He was still looking for proof when he died." "Blackwood must have found out," Silas said, his voice a low growl. "Your husband's death. It wasn't an accident, was it?" The unspoken question hung between them, a horrifying possibility. The official report said Thomas had been thrown from his horse during a pursuit. But now that simple explanation seemed too neat, too convenient. Blackwood had not only murdered his brother, but had likely murdered her husband to conceal the crime. The weight of it all became too much. Ilara felt a sob rise in her throat, a year of suppressed grief and a week of terror finally breaking through her composure. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. Silas did not move to comfort her in the conventional way. He simply sat beside her, his presence a solid, unshakable anchor in her storm of sorrow. He remained there, a silent guardian, until her tears subsided, his stillness a promise that she was no longer alone in this fight. As the sun bled crimson across the horizon, painting the sky in hues of fire and blood, they sat together on the porch, two solitary figures bound by a dead man's honor and a killer's long shadow. The quiet war was about to become a loud one. The unforgiving wind was rising, and with it came the promise of a final terrible storm. The storm broke without warning. One afternoon, the sky turned a bruised, sickly yellow. The air grew thick and still charged with an oppressive energy. A low moan began on the horizon, a sound that grew steadily into a deafening roar as a colossal wall of dust and sand rolled toward redemption. It was a sandstorm of biblical proportions, a force of nature that swallowed the sun and plunged the world into a gritty, howling twilight. Ilara and Silas were in town, having brought the letter to Marshal Calloway. The marshal, a man perpetually swimming in his own inadequacy, had stared at the affidavit as if it were a venomous snake. This is explosive, Mrs. Miller," he'd stammered. "Atticus Blackwood. I can't just—" Before he could finish his prevarication, the storm hit. The wind shrieked like a banshee, rattling the windows of the marshal's office. Sand began to seep through every crack, coating the room in a fine brown powder. The world outside vanished into a maelstrom of violent, swirling grit. "No one's going anywhere in this," Calloway said, his relief palpable. "We'll be trapped here for hours." But Blackwood was not a man to be deterred by weather. The saloon doors across the street burst open, and Blackwood himself strode into the storm, a long coat billowing around him. He was flanked by two of his most ruthless men. He marched directly to the marshal's office and threw the door open, bringing the storm inside with him. Marshal Blackwood said, his voice cutting through the howl of the wind. A word. His cold eyes found Ilara and Silas. "It seems we all have business to discuss." He smiled, a thin, cruel slash in his handsome face. "Let's move this to a more civilized venue. The saloon. We'll wait out the storm together." It wasn't an invitation. It was a command. The saloon was an island of flickering lantern light in the roaring darkness. The few patrons had been sent away, leaving only the key players in the drama. The wind howled outside, shaking the very foundations of the building. Sand streamed through the cracks in the walls, and the lanterns swayed, casting long, menacing shadows that danced and writhed like trapped spirits. Blackwood stood at the bar, pouring himself a whiskey. "So, Mrs. Miller," he began, his voice deceptively calm, "you've been a busy woman. Digging up the past. It's an unhealthy habit." He turned his gaze to Silas. "And you? I should have remembered your face. You've grown. Prison does that to a man, I suppose. Hardens him or breaks him." He took a slow sip of his whiskey. "You've found a letter. You believe you've uncovered some great secret. You've come to this spineless excuse for a lawman," he said, gesturing at Calloway with his glass, "thinking justice will be served." He laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "There is no justice in redemption. There is only my will." "You murdered your brother Blackwood," Ilara said, her voice clear and steady, despite the thunder of the storm and the pounding of her heart. "You murdered him, and let an innocent man take the blame." Innocent Blackwood sneered, turning his full attention to Silas. "He was a common thief, part of my brother's misguided rebellion. Liam was weak, sentimental. He would have dragged the family name through the mud. I did what was necessary. A mercy killing, you might say." "And what about my husband?" Ilara challenged, stepping forward. "Was that a mercy killing too?" Blackwood's face darkened. "Your husband was a meddling fool who couldn't let the past lie. He got what he deserved." He placed his glass on the bar with a sharp click. "But enough of this tedious history lesson. We're here to discuss the future. Your future." He gestured to one of his men, who produced the deed to her ranch and a pen. "My offer still stands. Sign the deed, and you can walk out of here when the storm passes. You and your guardian. Refuse and you won't. My men are waiting just outside of town. When the wind dies down, they have their orders. They will burn not just your ranch, but this entire pathetic town to the ground as a lesson in obedience." The ticking clock was the howling of the wind. The stakes were no longer just her land or the truth. They were the lives of everyone in redemption. Marshal Calloway, pale and sweating, looked from Blackwood to Alara, utterly paralyzed. Alara knew she couldn't rely on him. She had to use the only weapon she had left, the truth. "You think you've won," she said, her voice ringing with a conviction that momentarily silenced the room. "But you've miscalculated. You didn't just kill your brother. You created a witness who has nothing left to lose." She looked at Silas. Blackwood followed her gaze, a cruel smile playing on his lips. Him, a convict, his testimony is worthless. "My testimony is not what you should fear," Silas said, speaking for the first time. His voice was a low growl that vibrated through the floorboards. It was the sound of a landslide starting. He took a step forward, drawing all the light and shadow in the room toward him. "When Sheriff Miller arrested me, he took my statement. He knew I was telling the truth. But he also knew he didn't have enough to convict you. Not yet. He told me something before they took me away. He said, 'The truth doesn't need to shout, son. It just needs to be heard by the right people at the right time.'" Silas looked past Blackwood, his eyes locking on Marshal Calloway. "He lodged a copy of my sworn testimony with the territorial judge in the capital. He sent it by federal mail the day after the robbery. He noted it in his official log. A log that is sitting in your office right now, Marshal. A log that makes my testimony official. It corroborates the teller's letter. It's the proof he needed." Blackwood's confident smirk wavered. He stared at Silas, and then at the Marshal, whose eyes widened in dawning realization. The final piece had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. "He's bluffing." Blackwood snarled, but the seed of doubt had been planted. "Are you willing to bet your life on that?" Silas countered, his voice like rolling thunder. "Because when this storm passes, the first thing the Marshal is going to do is check that log. And when he finds it, he'll have no choice but to wire the territorial judge. Your empire will crumble, Blackwood. Your name will be synonymous with fratricide. You'll hang." The truth spoken with such absolute certainty shattered Blackwood's composure. The mask of the civilized cattle baron fell away completely, revealing the desperate, cornered killer beneath. With a roar of pure rage, he drew his pistol. "Then no one leaves this room alive." But Silas was already moving. He was not a man of wasted motion. In one fluid, powerful movement, he upended a heavy oak table, sending it crashing toward Blackwood and his men. Wood splintered, whiskey bottles shattered. In that split second of confusion, Silas crossed the room, putting his immense body between Blackwood and Alara, a living shield. Blackwood's men opened fire, their shots wild in the dim, chaotic light. But Marshal Calloway, galvanized by Silas's revelation and shamed into action, finally found his courage. He drew his own weapon, the sound of his Colt deafening in the enclosed space. "Drop your weapons, it's over, Atticus." The standoff was brief and brutal. In the heart of the raging sandstorm, with the world outside screaming, the fight for redemption's soul was decided by a few seconds of violent clarity. When the gun smoke cleared, Blackwood's men were down, and Atticus Blackwood himself stood with the Marshal's gun pressed to his temple, his face a mask of disbelief and utter ruin. The storm inside the saloon had finally broken. As if on cue, the wind began to subside. The furious shriek softened to a mournful whistle, and then to a sigh. Sunlight, hazy and filtered through a sky thick with dust, began to creep back into the saloon. The storm was over. In its aftermath, the town of Redemption was transformed. When Marshal Calloway emerged from the saloon with Atticus Blackwood in irons, the townspeople who had huddled in their homes came out into the sand-coated streets. They saw the mighty cattle baron, the man who had ruled their lives through fear, now defeated and exposed. The truth of his crimes spread through the town, like wildfire fueled by Calloway's newfound sense of duty and Doc Abernathy's grim confirmation of the old murder. The power Blackwood had held over them evaporated into the dusty air. They looked at Alara Miller and the silent giant at her side, not with pity or suspicion, but with a dawning, grudging respect. The journey back to the ranch was quiet. The landscape was new-scoured and reshaped by the storm, much like their own lives. That evening, as a bruised purple twilight settled over the plains, Alara and Silas sat at her small kitchen table. The locket lay on the table between them, its silver surface gleaming in the lamplight. "Everything you did," Alara began, her voice thick with emotion, "was for him, for Thomas." Silas looked at the photograph of the sheriff on the mantelpiece, his expression unreadable. "He was a just man in an unjust world," he said simply. "I owed him the truth, and I owed it to you to protect what he loved." "He would have been grateful," she said softly. She had to ask the question that lingered between them, the final ghost to be laid to rest. "Silas, my husband's death, do you truly believe Blackwood was behind it?" Silas was silent for a long time, choosing his words with care. "Men like Blackwood don't leave loose ends, and your husband was the biggest loose end of all. We may never have proof, but in my heart, I believe he died fighting for the truth. He died a hero." Alara finally allowed herself to accept it. The grief was still there, a familiar ache in her chest, but now it was mingled with a fierce pride. Her husband hadn't been a victim of a random accident. He had been a soldier in a war against darkness, a war that they had just won. She picked up the locket, holding the image of her husband's kind, honest face. She had fought to preserve his memory, his legacy, and now it was time to honor it by living again. Weeks turned into a month. The rhythm of the ranch returned, but it was a new rhythm. The townspeople, no longer living in fear, began to visit, offering help to rebuild the barn, bringing loaves of bread and sacks of grain. They spoke to Silas, not as an indentured servant, but as a man of substance, a man to be respected. The ranch began to flourish under their combined efforts. The scars of the fire faded, replaced by the frame of a new barn and the promise of a peaceful future. One cool autumn morning, as the scent of winter hung on the air, Alara stood before the fireplace. She took her husband's sheriff badge from its place of honor on the mantelpiece. For a year, it had been a symbol of her loss. Now, it was a symbol of his victory. She polished the silver star until it shone, then placed it gently inside a small wooden box along with a tattered letter that had revealed the truth. She closed the lid with a soft click. She was not erasing his memory, but enshrining it, honoring his past by choosing to embrace her future. She walked out onto the porch. Silas was there, mending a saddle, his large hands working the leather with a practiced, gentle skill. The morning sun caught the lines of his face, a face that was no longer just a mask of stone, but one she knew as well as her own. She walked over to him and, without a word, placed her hand on his. He stopped his work, his hand turning to clasp hers. His touch was warm and strong, a silent confirmation of everything that had passed between them and everything that was yet to come. It was a promise of a shared future built not on a contract of servitude, but on a foundation of loyalty, sacrifice, and a quiet, profound love. Later that day, while sorting through the last of her husband's things in the wooden box, she found something she had overlooked: his personal journal. She opened it to the last entry written just days before his death. Her breath caught as she read the familiar, neat script. Met with the prisoner Silas again today before his transfer. He holds no malice. There is more honor in that man, than in a dozen landowners like Blackwood. He speaks of a debt, but I believe it is the world that is in debt to men like him. If ever I should fall, I pray that a man of such quiet strength might find his way to Alara's side. He would be a shield for her, I know it. Tears streamed down Alara's face, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of gratitude, of peace. It was a final blessing from the grave, a loving husband's last wish fulfilled. She closed the journal and looked out the window at the endless plains where Silas was walking the fence line, a solitary, steadfast figure against the vast open sky. He was her guardian, her partner, her redemption. And their story forged in fire and truth was just beginning.